Thank you for joining the McCain Institute's Authors and Insights Book Talk series, a series of discussions with authors of important newly released books on American politics, policy, and leadership. My husband fought his whole life to promote American character-driven leadership and democracy to the public, and it's incredibly important today to carry that legacy forward by any means necessary. Today's installment, A Portrait of Character-Driven Leadership and Service, will feature two very dear friends of mine. Joe Lieberman will be talking with Mark Salter about his new book, The Luckiest Man, Life with John McCain, which details major events that happened in my husband's life, from his childhood to his naval service, but also including aspects of his life that the public eye wasn't able to see. Please enjoy the backstage portrait of John's years of public service from those who knew him best.
Well, good afternoon. I assume I'm on, and I'm glad to welcome you. First, let me thank Cindy for taking the time to introduce Mark Salter and me, and for her very kind words about both of us. They mean a lot to me, and I know they do to Mark as well. As Cindy said, this is another installment of the Authors and Insights book talk series sponsored by the McCain Institute, interviewing authors of new books on American politics, policy, and leadership to affirm the importance of character-driven leadership, as well as America's leadership in the international community. This is no ordinary author. This is Mark Salter. And the subject of the book is no ordinary subject. This is John McCain, as in the McCain Institute. I must say, Mark, that in the text they gave me for the introduction, it talks about character-driven leadership. John was a character-driven leader. He was also a hell of a character. And I think you capture that beautifully in the book. I'm auditioning to be a talk show host on television. So this is the copy of the book. I read it with great interest and appreciation. I must say, as much time as I spent with John, and as a dear a friend as he was, and as much as I thought I knew about him, I learned a lot that I did not know about him. And it's in that sense a very special book. There will be, I'm sure, over time, histories of the life of John McCain written by others. There will be histories of the period of time in which John was a leader in our country that will include John. But nobody will write a history who was with John through his life and career as much as Mark Salter was, and it was as close to John. So this is a very special book, and I think Mark, you've really captured. John was so complicated. So let me put it another way: diverse. He was a varied personality, but you captured here. Also, there's a lot of very good detail in this book, and it's of value in its own right, of course, because it's a great book. But you provided raw material for future historians as well, and frankly for students of government who want to know how to make a difference. So anyway, I thank you for writing it. As his friend, I think you've done a great tribute to him, and I hope that the book sells a lot of copies. Very often you were called John's alter ego. I'd like to think you were his muse. But in addition to being John's alter ego, you are a person in your own right, and at the risk of making you uncomfortable, I thought I would first ask you to talk a little bit about yourself, and you did a little bit in the book, which I was fascinated by, particularly what you did when you left high school. But you can come to that. But just tell us a little bit about what your folks were like, where you were raised, and what you did before you met. As I know you met John when you were working for Ambassador Kirkpatrick at the UN, but just sort of take a quick trip through your life until you met John.
Sure, it's a lot less interesting and eventful than John's was, but I was born in the first Eisenhower administration in Iowa, in a Mississippi River town called Davenport.
Right.
Middle class family. My mom was a grade school teacher, a Catholic grade school teacher, and my dad was a salesman for a mining company. I lacked direction, so to speak, when I was younger, and when I graduated from high school, in that pursuit, I was probably close to the McCain model of getting as close to the bottom of the class as I could without flunking out. I worked. I was a gandy dancer, a section gang laborer on a railroad that ran up and down the Mississippi River in the area that I grew up in, and it was a sort of an unskilled labor job. I pounded spikes into ties.
Right.
There's actually a skill to that. It's in the wrists, not really, but it was very, very cold in the wintertime and very, very hot in the summertime. And it was quite difficult work.
Did you go home at night, or did you keep moving with the?
I went home at night. The railroad I worked for was a jointly owned line owned by the Milwaukee Railroad and the Burlington Northern, and we had a lot of farm implement factories up on both sides of the Iowa and Illinois side of the river. And this was just a special line that ran to all those founderies. So I would go home every night and thaw out in the winter time, which took a while. And but it was, you sort of looked around and you realized this takes a toll on you. And I would see guys that were 50 or something and looked like they were 80, and I realized maybe I should do something else. And
good move. You did it for what, 3 or 4 years?
About 4 years, yeah. And I was hanging out in a rock and roll cover band, singing a little bit, backups in harmony with them, and enjoying myself. But I decided I would take what few savings I had and my beat up Oldsmobile Cutlass and drive to Cedar Falls, Iowa, to the University of Northern Iowa, and enrolled there and spent a couple of years and then transferred to Georgetown, and then one thing led to another.
Yeah. So you got your undergraduate degree from Georgetown.
From Georgetown, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and then what was your first job out of Georgetown?
It was, I worked at the State Department. I had an internship for 6 months and I got a clearance, a top secret clearance there, which is what made the internship valuable. They didn't pay me anything, but I worked in the little intelligence bureau in the State Department, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and did that for about 6 months. And then all my business school buddies at Georgetown had gone to New York to make money, and I went to New York just to have fun, and I knew a lot of people at the U.S. mission to the UN there, because Jean Kirkpatrick had been Ronald Reagan's first ambassador to the UN, and she brought a lot of Georgetown people with her. And so I walked in there one day and applied for a job in the press office.
And you got it.
I got it, yeah. And after a year or two, I started writing speeches, and that was that. Then in 1980.
Forgive me for interrupting, but
sure.
when I got involved in the Democratic Leadership Council, after the second Reagan victory, to try to move the party in a way back to the center, it's simplistic. But one of the things we said is we wanted the Democrats to stand for a foreign and defense policy that would never again enable anyone to say what Jean Kirkpatrick said as she left the Democratic Party, which was the Democrats were the blame America first party.
Yeah.
Not America first, but blame America. So we did for a while. It's still a struggle. Anyway, so how did you meet John while you were working for Jean Kirkpatrick?
Well, she came out of of course, the Scoop Jackson wing and the Truman wing of the Democratic
Right,
Party.
right.
She was, very strong on anti-Soviet and strong on national defense.
Right.
I accompanied her. I hesitate to say I wrote her speech to the '88 convention, George H.W. Bush's convention,
That was a great one.
because
Yeah.
nothing you write for ever survived her rewrites. But I sent a draft of a speech to her for that event, and she wrote something else, but I got to accompany her down there anyway. And we were doing some interviews. She was doing interviews afterwards. She'd kindly agreed to do a bunch of interviews. And the last one of the night, I couldn't find it. It was in the Superdome, a cavernous place, and I just couldn't locate the place where it was to occur. And so I had a walkie-talkie to the press shop and asked for a volunteer to be sent up to take us to this last interview before she left for the night. That volunteer happened to be Tory Clark, who was at that point John McCain's, John was in his first Senate term. She was his press secretary. We became good friends, hit it off that night, went out and had a couple of drinks, and we're, walking down Bourbon Street. She introduced me to a whole bunch of different McCain staffers and friends, and including John's then scheduler, Diane McClellan. And then the next night she said, well, come watch Bush's acceptance speech from the Arizona delegation. And they had prime real estate on the floor. And so I went, and she introduced me to John. When I met him, I hadn't known him, or I'd seen his speech on Monday, thought it was pretty good. And he said something to the effect of, Tory says you're a good writer, maybe you can write for me sometime. And that led to a couple or three freelance speech jobs for him. The speeches all seemed to work out. And then one day he called me in, and to my surprise, offered me the foreign affairs assistant job in his office. And I took it. And that began a 30-year association with him. And during which I married his scheduler, Diane McClellan. So
I was just going to ask you whatever happened to Diane, but I knew the answer.
We had two kids. So when people asked me, what was your plan, or your career plan? I said, I plan to get lost in the Superdome and let the rest of my life happen.
Well, it happened to everybody else's benefit. And I know you think it happened to your benefit too. So that was great. Thank you for doing that. So I thought that in terms of John's background, your description of his mom and dad and their influence on him was really interesting. I mean, I had talked to him over the years about both of them, and I obviously didn't know his father because he had passed away by the time I met John. I did know Roberta McCain. She was something. I'll just tell you one story. I probably told you already, but at the 2008 convention in Minneapolis, we're in the same hotel. And I don't know, I was out somewhere and I come back to get changed to go over for the evening convention. And she's at the elevator because she's going over early to do some event for John. And she's all dressed up. And, she's 96 then. So I say to her what I really felt. I said, Mrs. McCain, you look beautiful. She stops for like a second and she says, are you trying to pick me up? Well, that tells you a lot about Roberta. So just sort of talk with us a little bit about his father and his mother, and to what extent, because all of us to some extent are shaped by our parents. John, this remarkable figure in our lives and in American history, was shaped by his folks.
Yeah, the easy thing about writing about John was he didn't keep a lot hidden. There wasn't a big difference between the private and the public John McCain. Sometimes to his detriment. He was, he could be a little bit guarded about his parents, particularly his dad. And I think his dad had, obviously, he felt the burden of a family legacy, a military legacy that stretched back to the Revolution.
Right.
And he, the sort of slew and Jack McCain ethos of an officer doesn't lie, cheat, or steal, that informed John's kind of code of conduct that he lived by. And his father was a great man, and he knew the burden of it, I think. But his father also, as John would and others have talked about, had a drinking problem. He had two things. One, he was a workaholic. He once told me that the difference between my grandfather and my father was that my grandfather loved the Navy, and my dad lived for the Navy.
Mm,
And I asked him to give me an example of that that would show the difference of it. And he said, well, on Christmas, we would open our presents, and then my dad would go upstairs and put on his uniform, come back downstairs and walk to work. And you could see it, there was some resentment there, I think,
right.
a little bit.
Right.
And when he would refer, he would be not cryptic about his father's drinking problem. He'd be quite blunt. He thought he attributed to World War II, where, the strain of a submarine command, they would go out for 5-6 week patrols and, get depth charged and all these, terrifying experiences, and then
Right.
come back to Midway or some other forgotten, sub base somewhere, and they put them in a house somewhere and fill it with booze, and they could drink for 6 weeks before they had to go out again. And he said he thinks that's where his father acquired the binge drinking habit that he had, and struggled against all his life. And he would put it in context of a heroic struggle. His father's struggle, that he said he would pray on his knees every night for the strength to stop, and he admired it and everything. But I said, well, what was your father like when he was drunk? And then he would get sort of a little tight-lipped. He just said, I didn't recognize him. And I said,
Right.
what do you mean by that? I said, he was a completely different person. And that's all he would really say about it.
Yeah, I was fascinated because you mentioned a few times that he and you would have a vodka. He'd have a vodka or something.
Yeah.
In all our travels and time together, I never saw him drink very much.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know what that was, because and I'm sure some of that was related to his dad. I always remember that the fact that I remember it shows how rare it was. Well, two things. One, at the Munich Security Conference, which we went to together for about 25 years, he sort of began this tradition where when we went out for dinner a Friday night, which he would call the Shabbat dinner, the Friday night Sabbath dinner, he would order a schnapps, one of those sweet, pretty high alcohol content. Yeah. And we wish each other and everybody else the best. The night before I endorsed him in 2008, he and Tom Ridge and Steve Dupre and I went out in New Hampshire to the Common Man restaurant, which you've been to, I'm sure, and for dinner. And he did have a glass of vodka, which was rare to me.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I was interested that he probably let his guard down a little more with you, but I never saw him drink to excess at all. And I think that had to be, as happens in a lot of people we all know, based on what he had seen in his father.
Right. No, I never, not once in my presence did he ever. I remember we were wandering around the streets of Prague in their first re-election once, and we both had maybe one beer more than would be normal for us. It was a celebratory, wonderful evening. But I'd never seen him, and really, he limited himself to one or two vodkas. He loved to barbecue, as you know, and he would love to sip his vodka on ice with an onion, and but very slowly. Never. And he told me once when we were talking about, he had kind of a wild bachelor days. He was famous for his parties in Virginia Beach when he was a young naval aviator, and when he was at Pensacola, and he said, I'll let you in on a secret. Most of the time I was just drinking Coca-Cola. That he did. I don't think even as a kid he was much of a drinker, and I'm sure he didn't tell me that, but one assumes that had something to do with his father's.
Yeah.
Having said that, I don't want to emphasize the sort of hard parts of his relationship with his father. He admired his father very much, and he had a line that he repeated all the time, that his father and his grandfather's respect for him was the most lasting ambition of his life. That lasted long after their deaths.
Yeah, I was struck by that, and it is true that our sometimes a lot of our lives are shaped by a sense of our parents and what they expect of us, particularly I think with men, but not always, our fathers. And I know in my case, without digressing too much, my dad came out of high school after a complicated childhood during the Depression. He couldn't go to college. He was very smart. And, he opened a little store, and he did fine, and he was happy, built a family. But I realized a little bit later on, because it was subconscious, that part of what was motivating me was to take advantage of the opportunities that I had, in part because of him, that he never had.
Mhm.
So to what extent do you think that the heroism of John's father and grandfather were part of the tremendous drive that he had? We know he always joked about how badly he did at the Naval Academy,
Yeah.
but in not so long after that, he began to be a tremendous achiever, really.
Yeah, I think a great deal. I mean, it certainly informed his sort of, standard of honor, his honor code, the honor, the sort of
Right,
amalgam, from his father and grandfather, from the Naval Academy, from Episcopal's honor codes, from the
right,
POW honor code, and from the literature he read. He had this. I wouldn't say it was that idiosyncratic, but it was. It had many sources. His sort of the code of conduct John tried to live by, and I think I know when we talked in prison about when he refused amnesty, he refused because, one, he knew that his father's position, the Vietnamese would use his father's position as a way to demoralize the other POWs. They say,
right.
you're stuck here, but the admiral's kid, we let him go, of course, and America's class conscious society and all that stuff. But it also, he said, I didn't take it because I didn't, I thought my father would be disappointed in me, and when they beat him for 3 days after that, and forced him to make a propaganda statement, he told me that the thing that worried him the most, they recorded it, and that he knew his father would hear it,
Yeah,
and that's what and I
yeah,
was ashamed.
yeah. That's very compelling.
Yeah.
How about his mom? What
Well,
effect do you think she had on John?
well, you could see her in him.
Right, I agree.
In a million ways.
Right,
As you know, he was one of the most restlessly curious people I've ever met. Everything
absolutely.
fascinated the guy. It's like,
No,
you know, you
really,
know,
everything.
absolutely
Why
everything
is
he encountered. If he hadn't encountered before, it was a subject of intense interest. That's Roberta through and through. The sort of his love of adventure. His wit. I didn't know his father, like you. His father had passed away long before I met
right?
him. I didn't know Roberta though, and I would see her in him all the time. And I would say, well, who do you take after? He goes, my mother.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. He was aware of it.
yeah,
He was very proud of her and got a kick out of her. So let's go a little bit toward the Vietnam experience, which you already touched on. The first time I went to Vietnam with him, as the plane was landing, he said to me, I just want to prepare you for something. If people recognize me, it's going to be a reaction that you wouldn't expect.
yeah.
And so sure enough, we're on the street. I think we had just come out of or going into the Hanoi Hilton, actually, the
Mhm.
museum. And there's a group of high school or college students, Vietnamese, and they recognize him.
Sure.
And they start to chant, McCain, McCain. And
Yeah.
they swarm around. They want autographs. They want pictures.
Yeah.
So, and when they left and we were back in the bus or car or whatever, I said, yeah, you told me it was going to be an unusual reaction. It was really amazing. What the hell was that?
Yes.
So he said, it's for two reasons, I think. One is they think I was treated a lot better here when I was here than I was. In other words, their government has told them.
Right.
And the second is they know that I was involved. This was a humble statement.
Yeah.
I was involved in the normalization of relations between the U.S. and Vietnam. So just talk a little bit. I mean, you deal with it, and I think in a very effective way in the book, but about both aspects of that, both his time in and then the normalization of it.
Well, his time in, it's a well-known story told by himself and others. Bob Timber, wrote a wonderful account of it, but there are others as well. But he had a tough. He was there 5.5 years. The first 2 years were the worst. He was at most of that time. He started in the Hanoi Hilton, the Wa Lo, what's the Americans called the Hanoi Hilton, but it's a big trapezoid-shaped sandstone prison that takes up an entire city block in the center of Hanoi. You
Right.
can't go anywhere in Hanoi without driving by it. And I remember we had driven by it once or twice. The first time I went with him was a long time ago. There wasn't even a paved road from the airport in Hanoi then. There were no cars on the street or anything else. And I think we'd gone by it twice or something. And I said, where, John, where's the Hanoi Hilton? And he just shot his thumb like that. That's it right there.
Yeah.
You know, he didn't, you know, that's Wallow. That's Wallow. And, but after they took him to the hospital at the beginning of his imprisonment, they put him, he got out of the hospital, he was in terrible shape. They put him in with two Air Force pilots in another prison called Plantation, which had been a film studio or something before the war. And that's after he got a little bit healthier, because he was in terrible shape when he got out of the prison, down to about 100 pounds. Bud Day was one of his roommates, thought he was going to die.
Right.
Thought the Vietnamese had given him to us so they could blame us for him dying. He as you know, he had a remarkable willpower, and he willed himself to live, and got a little bit better. They put him in solitary as soon as he was, you know, well enough to take care of himself, and spent 2 years there, and they were just able to talk to people on either side of his cell through tap code. And Bob Craner, the great and unfortunately late Lauren Craner's dad, was
Right.
The person John said I was closest to in my entire life, you know, because they told each other everything for 2 years. And he was in the cell next door, but they never knew what each other looked like till the day they were released from prison. So if you can imagine that, to become that intimate with someone and know them so well that they think that you know them better than their closest family members, and yet have no idea what they look like, you know, for years. And he went to Bob Craner when the Vietnamese offered him amnesty, and talked it over with Bob Craner. Craner had told him, you should take it. You're not in good enough shape. You know, there's a chance you won't survive. But he didn't take it. And as we talked about earlier, he was tortured severely over that. And he said, you know, then, you know, it went on in solitary for a while, and until 1970, 71, they started moving them into big group cells back in the Hanoi Hilton. And he said, and their treatment got a lot better after that, he said. But 5.5 years, you know, because of his support for normalization, there were a lot of crazy QAnon type conspiracy theories about him, you know, Manchurian candidate, you know, kind of stuff we're seeing today, you know, just wild stuff. But they would always, you know, you would hear, you know, the part of the conspiracy was he was the only POW to gain weight while he was in prison. You can see the pictures of him the day he's released. He's skinny as a rail, you know, it's like he's emaciated, you know, his teeth are all knocked out, you know, he's obviously pretty crippled as he's walking, you know. It was McCain being McCain, you know, they had given him a pair of crutches to hobble around on, but he before he went up the gangplank to the plane that was going to take him to the Philippines, you know, he threw the crutches aside and limped his way up.
He was his own faith healer.
Yeah, the normalization, you know, it's probably one of my most the memories I revere the most of working with him.
Yeah,
because it was such an honest, honorable, decent thing for him to do, you know. He felt really sincerely that he had gotten over Vietnam as soon as he left the country, and he couldn't understand and didn't want his country to continue to fail to get over it, you know, and he thought this was necessary to that. And the Vietnamese had agreed to cooperate with us on finding, you know, resolving all these MIA cases, and had gotten out of Cambodia as we'd requested, and then had per McCain's specific request, had released South Vietnamese military and political people they were still holding in re-education camps. He said they kept their end of the bargain. We must keep ours. Let's start normalization. Bill Clinton had a hard time doing that for the obvious reason. He had evaded the draft, and that had been very controversial. Some of his advisors told him, there's nothing in this for you. It's bad politics. Veterans will march on Washington and chain themselves to the White House fence. And McCain told him that's all BS. That's not going to happen. Most veterans are going to be like me. They're ready to move forward, you know, this. And so it was a painstaking process that he and John Kerry really led. And it was not without its bizarre moments. They formed this select committee on POW/MIAs, and it got a little crazy at times. But it was just an honest, honorable thing. And I'll remember forever, really. And I sometimes choke up thinking about it, but John Kerry was very thorough in terms of putting together lots of meetings with lots of people, and everybody with a stake in the issue would be involved. And these meetings would go on interminably. And sometimes they were on at the White House. Yeah. And Bill Clinton being Bill Clinton, he'd stick there till the end, and
this is not John's style.
No. And I remember I think Cindy was having a minor operation or something, and he had a flight scheduled back to Phoenix, and he had to get up and leave before the president left, and he was embarrassed by it,
Yeah.
So Kerry said, well, we're going to go talk to Clinton one more time, to get him to move on lifting the trade embargo. And he said, I'm not going down there, John, if this goes on for 2 hours again. I'll take 15 minutes of the president's time and no more than that. So they said, fine, it'll just be you and me and Clinton. Well, it turned out to be Clinton and a couple of the head of the VA, and I think a couple of NSC people, right, and me, and an aide to Senator Kerry, and Nancy Stetson, if you remember her from the Foreign Relations Committee.
Yes.
And, John Kerry, in pretty brief for John Kerry, laid out the case for normalization, and very concisely, I thought, and persuasively. And then President Clinton turned to John and said, we're in the Oval Office. And he said, John, I'd like to hear what you think. And John said, all he said was, I think I'm quoting almost verbatim, it doesn't matter to me anymore who was for the war and who was against the war. I'm tired of looking back in anger, and I'm tired of our country looking back in anger. And if you'll normalize relations with the Vietnamese, I'll back you 100%. That's all he said, and it was
great.
Very moving, very moving.
Very moving, and it's him, and I'm sure it had a powerful effect on President Clinton. Also, the whole story is actually one of the great accomplishments of John's life, because he set a standard, a role model for, I can't think of a more creative word, for forgiveness,
Yeah.
and also for not letting what happened in the past weigh down the rest of your life. I mean, good God, they held him for 5.5 years. They tortured him for a good part of it, all of that. He almost died more than once. Yeah. And yet he said, let's move on, which was really remarkable.
And I used to, believe me, I would that was my default go-to whenever we got stories about, oh, McCain's got such a temper, he never forgets a grudge. I said, are you kidding me? He normalized relations with Vietnam.
I know. Incidentally, it was, he could keep grudges, but you tell stories, and I was, although we were very close, and I can only probably remember 1 or 2 times when he got angry at me about something. But, and that one time I remember, I walked out the room, and then by the time I got back to my office in the Capitol, he was on the phone. Where'd you go? You told me to leave the room. What? Get back.
Yeah, that was normally when he lost his temper. One, it got such an outsized reputation for it, because he would when he lost it, he tended to lose it with his peers, not his subordinates. Yeah. Most of us revered him, and once in a while we got in it with him, because he'd argue, but he'd respect you if you argued right back with him. The worst thing you could do would be, just sort of slink out of his, if you gave it back to him, he'd all right, fair enough, but and when I'd see him lose it 9 times out of 10, it was just a situation like that. I mean, I tell a story about him yelling at Malcolm Wallop, the late senator from Wyoming once.
That was a great story. Go ahead.
He really erupted on the guy on the phone. The minute he hung the phone up, he looked at John Raitt and I, who were in the room with him, said, too tough. I should call him back. And then he immediately called him back.
I got a kick out of the many times in the book when you quoted him talking to you.
Yeah.
He refers to you as boy.
Yeah, always.
Now but some people might be offended by that. I know you weren't, and it reminded me, once we were on a plane somewhere, and Vance Serchuk, who was my
Very well. Yeah.
foreign policy guy and national security guy for my staff in the Senate for the last 6 years. And Vance was sitting behind us with the staff, and John said, "I got to ask Vance about that." So I guess I can speak openly on this. Of course, they're saying 4-letter words on TV now. So John yells, "Vance, you little shit, get up here." So Vance comes like shaking, he's out of, I forgot what, but Yale Law School anyway. I forgot where he went to, Princeton.
Yeah.
So John asked him the question, he goes back, and then a minute later I walked back and I said, the fact that John called you a little shit means that you are now inside. You're with the family, you're with the team. Boy, we missed him telling these stories. It was so great, even though we had to put up with the same jokes over and over again. But I think I said this in my eulogy at his funeral, but one of the most many talk about his knowledge of so many things, curiosity. So I forgot why we were on a plane somewhere, and I said to him, "Oh, that reminds me of an old Henny Youngman line. You probably never heard of Henny Youngman." So then he gives me rapid fire like 10 Henny Youngman one-liners, funny jokes. Anyway,
he's a Catskill. He was a Catskill comedian, John. That's his town halls. You always got 10 minutes straight from the Catskills.
So
and he stole all of them. Not an original joke.
Right? But so do the comedians for the most part. The year I retired, I will forward people to this from the Senate 2012. Among the nice farewells was a dinner held at the Israel embassy by then Ambassador Michael Oren, and it was a nice crowd there. Leon Panetta was there. Ehud Barak happened to be in town. He came. Janet Napolitano. Vice President Cheney came. There were too many speakers, and John is the last speaker because everybody knows how close we are. And he says, "I don't know what to say anymore." He says, "I'm going to make a big announcement. The only thing I can think of, everything's been said about him." So he says, "I'm announcing tonight I'm converting to Judaism." So he says, it's not that I have that much, love for Judaism. It's just traveling with Lieberman. I have to put up with, here I go again, so much Orthodox Jewish shit that I might as well become a member. Then he delivers like the most hysterical. If you were interested in more, go to YouTube, John McCain at the Israeli embassy dinner. Let me just, before I want to let people in on to ask some questions, but John was deeply devoted to human rights.
Yeah.
When we would travel around the world, he insisted on, particularly when we went to a country which was not a democracy, he would insist on seeing the opposition to the government, often at some peril and displeasure of the government. Usually at the American embassy, and they would get away with referring to them as civil society. And John became extremely important. He would call me periodically. Let's do a letter about the people who are fighting. Still, this sounds like today, Lukashenko in Belarus. Or let's go to, we're going into that region. If we go to, I forgot which country next to it we went to, we can get some of the opposition to come over and meet us, et cetera, et cetera. He really believed in it. And so, but I understand from his background and service, his patriotism, his military, his commitment to our security. But where did this commitment to human rights come from, do you think?
Oh, I think, everything that informed his code of conduct, made him that way. But, I think experiencing the best and worst of humanity in the same experience as he did, when I write about, because he had these dualities, and the most interesting was that he was like a romantic and a cynic, which usually they don't fit comfortably together. And but they did with him. He was a cynic about the world, but a romantic about his causes, and he never gave up hope, never. And he wrote in our last book together, not this one, but he wanted to write. You mentioned Belarus, but the Belarusians for here year after year after year, I see the same guys they can't, they won't let me in, so they have to come to Riga or where one of the Baltics to meet with me. And it's, you'd think they'd be discouraged, they'd lose hope. It's, they never, and he said, but the thing he admired most about them was that they just persisted. And he felt, he felt that the privilege or the pride of being an American elected official was that you were part of a project to prove that self-government was the only moral government and everybody's entitled to it.
Right.
And that was his great cause, and so when I'm watching the news now from Belarus, it just like, my God, he was right. He said they'll never lose hope. There's always hope. Even though he knew it's just how I think I wrote a line something like, the most marvelous of human achievements for McCain was to not lose hope when experience had taught you hope is for fools. And that was him, and that was the people he admired most in the world. And there was my daughter was a Peace Corps volunteer recently, and I've written about this too, but and I always have a hard time telling it because I always get choked up. It involves McCain, who I loved, and my daughter, who I love even more. And but she was teaching school in a village in the remote province of Cambodia, and one of her Cambodian counterparts, a Cambodian teacher, was talking to her informally one day, about all the problems the Cambodians have with their government, their autocratic government. And this guy had no idea she had any connection to John. And he said, but we have friends in America. John McCain is our friend. Now here's a guy in the back of beyond,
Right.
Didn't know my daughter was connected to him, that knew John McCain, not only knew John McCain's name, but knew him to be a friend who would help him if he could. That's really, there are only a handful of people in this world that have a global profile like that. And it's really, really the greatest testament to him.
That's a beautiful story, and you are absolutely right. I mean, it's not time for editorializing, but we've lost that for the moment in our country, and we've got to regain it because, and he did it quite naturally, and just over time. I had the same experience once in Myanmar, Burma, with 3 political prisoners just out of jail. We were at the home of Aung San Suu Kyi, and she wanted us to meet them. But they said through an interpreter that, and they looked terrible. They'd just been left. They were
Right.
Anyway, and she said, tell them a story, and they had heard in the prison. It was like almost a reenactment of what John had been through and what he admired in Natan Sharansky in response to Reagan saying that Russia was the evil empire. That McCain and I, because he asked me, but really McCain had issued a letter on behalf of these 3 guys when they were in jail, and word got to them, and they couldn't believe it, that John McCain had done this. And they basically said to him, you kept us alive, you sustained us until we could get out. So anyway, that's a great story. It's part of his legacy and part of the message that we got to get back to soon in America, because the world needs it.
He told me that story of that meeting, and he was very moved by it and got choked up when he's recalling it for me. He was very, very touched by it.
I appreciate it.
You talked about Sharansky. He traveled with Scoop Jackson when, to Israel, and the refuseniks would greet him and almost mob Jackson, everything. That made a lasting impression on him. He wanted that profile. He wanted that kind of reputation. Yeah. He wanted to be a guy who was known to the oppressed in the world as the American who was going to do right by them. And it mattered to him.
He achieved it just by his principle and his persistence. God bless him. God bless his memory.
Real quickly, though, I'd like to get you to tell a story too, because the Vance told me you guys had gone to a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan or Turkey or somewhere once.
Yeah, it was in
and
Turkey.
Kofi Annan had been there right before you and had been heckled.
Okay, so the war in Syria is getting brutal, really a catastrophe, and there were some refugee camps in the south of Turkey, which I guess were run by the UN, but there were a lot of people there. And we had actually gone into the south of Turkey and met with some of the leaders of the opposition in Syria who had come over the border. But then we wanted to go to the refugee camp. And when we arrived, whoever was there, either the UN official at the camp or maybe somebody from the American embassy in Turkey, said to us that Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, had been there in the morning, and it was really embarrassing that people had thrown their shoes at him, and he had to leave in a hurry, and just be prepared because these people really have a hard time. And we round the corner, and we hear the crowd shouting, and we get closer, we realize what they're shouting: McCain, McCain. And he was very touched by it.
Yeah.
And they brought these lovely little kids, boys and girls, probably, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, sang a song in Syrian greeting us. It was, I mean, it showed, there again, it showed what he stood for. And part of that was that they knew that he had, without hesitation, supported the opposition to Assad,
Yeah.
who had acted in so brutal a way that they had to run from their country and were living in these refugee camps in Turkey.
Yeah, that's a great story.
Yeah, that's it. We got a lot of them. So, okay, I really enjoyed this. I think we got some people who want to ask some questions. So,
Great.
Cole Davis, let me ask you to take over now and call on people, if you would, to ask.
Yep. We have a couple questions that have been sent in through the Q&A function. First
Good.
one, I'll read off from Rick Davis. Mark, can you discuss the Agents of Intolerance speech you wrote and McCain gave just before the South Carolina 2008 primary and its impact on the primary and how it relates to today's politics?
Yeah, well, we had just gone through the South Carolina primary, if my memory's right, and we had rebounded this is 2000, and we had John had lost that primary. Obviously, everyone knows that story. It was a rough campaign down there. There were a lot of third-party opposition to John that came in there with a lot of money, and some of that was well-known political evangelical leaders. I think we had rebounded already, or we had the Michigan primary, which we surprisingly rebounded in. And we decided that it would be good for John to address sort of the impact, because he felt strongly that some of the opposition to him in those quarters. I'm sorry, let me stop that. Was really based on campaign finance reform. They were against it because they were getting soft money, and so you had National Right to Life and others opposing John, on grounds that he wasn't conservative enough for them. But really, what their problem was his campaign finance reform proposal that played such a prominent role in the 2000 campaign. And so we wrote a speech. I think I wrote it over the weekend, where John was going to go down to Virginia Beach and deliver it, and make his case to social conservatives that he was right on most of their issues, and that the problem that some of their leaders had with him was over money, and they were also sending out a message that he did not think was Christian-like, which was unwelcoming to people who might disagree with him or might have questions, and that they were sort of acting to exclude people from the party. That was the idea behind the speech. I sometimes regret that we actually put a couple of names to it. We put Jerry Falwell's name in there and Pat Robertson's name in there. Not that I didn't have, not that I didn't think they deserved criticism. I did, but it made it look a little bit too personal, I thought, and it made it harder for McCain to be magnanimous with people like Jerry Falwell, who came to him years later and said, really, I didn't have a problem with you. It was Pat Robertson that did. Anyway, I think, Rick, I hope that's what you had in mind. I thought you were going to ask me about the South Carolina primary concession speech, which was really a memorable one, because we sort of torched Governor Bush in it for some of the tactics the campaign had run, and we got a lot of grief for it, for writing such a tough speech. But even my wife that night had called me and said, "What did you do?" But it helped us in Michigan, and I think it worked. But
you were right too.
Yeah,
it was the truth.
Yeah.
Cole, you got another one?
Yep, we have a couple more. This one comes from M Champion. He describes how big a hero Senator McCain was, and Senator Lieberman and Mark, this question falls kind of for both of you. He asks, how hard was it working alongside someone so confident and so outspoken?
It was exhausting. It was in good ways and bad. It was exhilarating. It was a lot of fun most of the time, a lot of hard work, a lot of long hours, thrilling, sometimes terrifying. He was candid and brave, and that usually produced good results, but every once in a while you'd find yourself in something of a pickle. But we always managed to get out of it somehow. And, so on the whole, it was, I look back, the book, the title of the book is Luckiest Man, and it's really a reference to him. But it's not incidental to that. I feel like meeting him was the great stroke of luck of my life.
Here. I agree with everything Mark has said, and it was not hard at all. I mean, when you traveled with him, we used to call them the death marches, because he just didn't want to rest, and he'd go be late at night but get up the next morning. And honestly, if there ever was somebody who stood for what I often thought of as a kind of religious principle, which is get the most out of every day you're alive, that was John. So and the exhaustion was well worth it. He was, you used the word, Mark, exhilarating, and it was. I miss him a lot, and I used to love when he would call, because I had no idea what he was going to say. He was, it was going to be either, why'd you say that? Not too often. Or, hey, let's go to the floor and have a colloquy about this outrage that's just happened. Or I've been reading about Bhutan in the Himalayas. Let's figure out how we can go there, So that it was, and just traveling with him. This is the story of and I'll do this quickly. Part of the problem with the current Senate and Congress is that people don't spend enough time with each other, but we traveled a lot as part of our membership on armed services, interest in foreign policy. We got to know each other. He'd be reading a book, I'd be reading a book, we'd talk about it, we'd watch a movie, and the conversations were serious or hilarious. And he would tell the same jokes and I'd laugh every time, just because he laughed every time, Anyway, okay, enough of that. I miss him.
Me too. But that Bhutan trip, it's just funny because, I meant to, I did some other interview and people said, well, how did he get over losing in 2008? And I said, he just went back to work. And, but I remember he called Richard Fontaine, I think the day after or 2 days after the election, when you think he'd be exhausted, because they're exhausting. They're physically, mentally, and emotionally draining experiences. And I had packed up my car and driven up to our house in Maine, where I just, became a recluse for a couple of weeks, but like Thursday or something, he gets a call. Richard Fontaine is then Foreign Affairs aide, gets a call. Let's get a trip together, boy, we won't make it a real hard one, because Fontaine made some remark like, don't you need to get a little rest before we'll just make it a quick one. But I think he ended up going to like 7 countries, and somebody talked him into going to Bhutan.
Yeah. We were in
or Bangladesh. I think somebody wanted to.
We went to Bangladesh on that trip. We were in India. I may be confused, but I think the terrorist act in Mumbai might have happened, but maybe not. But by the time you're in India, you're pretty close to Bhutan.
Yeah.
So we went to Bhutan. We had a great time.
And I think you met with the whole cabinet or something? Was that Bhutan or Bangladesh?
Well, in Bangladesh, we met with the whole cabinet. It was kind of interesting. We were only there overnight. In the morning, they did a big breakfast for us. That was a time they've had these 2 factions fighting brutally with each other forever, still going on. But at that point, there was a military government with a technocratic government, and we met with them. It was kind of interesting.
And didn't somebody tell them that we played your concession speech on national TV to show whoever loses this election how you're supposed to act in defeat? Because he was immensely proud of that when he returned. I remember.
Yes. That's interesting. That is absolutely right, because these two factions, both headed by women, interestingly, were fighting each other constantly, and everybody knew they were in a campaign that whoever lost was going to just keep the fight up. And I'm afraid that as moving as John's speech was, 2008, it didn't have the desired effect. So,
Alas.
okay, Cole.
We have time for a couple more. This one comes from Raul Romero. He talks about how Senator McCain was able to work with legislators regardless of their party. And his question is, what were his personal thoughts about the increasingly polarized political climate after the 2016 presidential election?
He lamented it. He was when he that was he spent the time he could, when he could still speak to people in public and make public addresses. It really was the subject of those addresses in Philadelphia with Joe Biden, and on the floor of the Senate when he returned a few days after brain surgery. That really was his message. We have so much more. It was really in the statement that he wanted released after his death. That was the message there, that we have so much more in common. We have shared responsibilities, and we do disagreements, and we've been entrusted with this sacred thing, this project to prove, that self-government is the only moral government. That it was, he was very concerned by it, and it's gotten worse, obviously, since he passed away. We could really use his example and his words right now. I think almost every day. I think you can feel. I can feel his absence in our politics, and it's a real shame.
You're absolutely right. I'll just add quickly that when he made that speech on the floor, when he the thumbs down on the Obamacare vote, some people didn't understand it was not about Obamacare at all. He wasn't for Obamacare. Right. It was about the process, and that the Republicans were trying to repeal Obamacare in the same partisan sort of blockaded way that it was passed. In other words, one party passes it, one party repeals it, and he said that's why he said let's go back in the Senate vocabulary to the regular order, which meant work it out, have a debating committee, have votes on the floor, and bring it to a vote and see what passes. So he really, I mean, that I think was the greatest need that our country had, and he made those final great contributions to the national dialogue, and hopefully we'll come back to it real soon. Okay.
He really lamented what had happened to the committee system, where the leaders in both parties have aggregated more and more authority into their own.
Right.
Bills are written by leadership staff, and he said, because in a committee, he said, that's where you really get to know the other side. That's where you really strike up bipartisan working relationships with people. That's why he liked to assemble his codos the way he did, where he'd match up real odd couples, because that was another way you got to know, and those things were important to him. He had learned those things as a naval officer in the Senate, traveling with senators, I think, and I think that too is another thing that's sort of lost in the Senate since he's gone.
I agree. The Senate misses him, not only do you and I.
Yeah.
Cole?
I think for the last question, bring two of these together from Peter Donald and David Kay. They ask, do you see anyone up and coming in today's politics who would follow in McCain's footsteps and the way he led, forgave, and was always in service to the country? And what might he be telling his GOP Senate colleagues who are up for re-election about their political fortunes and their principles and where voters are at?
Yeah, there are people. I think, it takes guts to be like him. But there are people on both sides of the aisle, I think, who would aspire to that kind of reputation. But they got to go out and earn it, and it takes guts, and it's not without risk. He wouldn't have begrudged people taking necessary precautions to hold on to their job. You can't affect the public good if you can't stay in office. To see an obvious wrong and not object to it, to let your party get driven to to something that becomes unrecognizable to you and not speak up against that. He he wouldn't appreciate that.
Hey, Mark, thank you. It's been a great discussion. You know, I was thinking during this discussion, I never had this thought before, maybe because I've been reading a lot of books about the founding generation of Americans, that honestly, John had a lot of qualities that were like that generation in terms of understanding national interest and being patriotic
It did.
and having similar values, which is quite a thing to say about somebody. I mean, we're so close to him that we probably I didn't appreciate it because, you know, but when you step back and think about him in history, he's right up there with them, really.
He had a sense of honor that was sacred, just as he did.
Sense of honor.
Yeah.
So thank you. A great
Thank you.
I loved it, and a great book.
Thanks for
See, I
saying.
marked the place I wanted to ask you about. Thanks, everybody, and thanks to the McCain Institute for hosting it. Cole, have we done it? Can we sign off?
I think you're good. Thank you, Senator Lieberman.
All right.
Thank you for joining us
Take
today.
care. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, Senator.